11-year-old Emma Chen is just another quiet passenger on Flight 447. But when both pilots collapse and all electrical systems fail at 30,000 feet, her secret aviation training becomes the only hope for 156 people. With no instruments and no radio, Emma must guide a crippled Boeing 777 to an impossible landing, using knowledge no child should ever need. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. 11-year-old Emma Chen sat in seat 12C of United Airlines Flight 447, staring out the window at the clouds below. She was small for her age, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a blue hoodie, nothing special, nothing that would make anyone notice her. The flight attendant, Patricia, walked past without really seeing her. She had been flying for 23 years, and children on planes fell into two categories: loud and annoying, or quiet and invisible. Emma was quiet. "Would you like a snack?" Patricia asked the businessman in 12A. "Pretzels and ginger ale," he said without looking up. Patricia turned to Emma. "Do you want anything?" "Water, please," Emma said softly. Patricia handed her a cup and moved on, already forgetting her. Emma didn't mind being invisible. She opened her small backpack and pulled out a worn notebook, Flight Procedures and Emergency Protocols, Private. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, diagrams of aircraft systems, and emergency checklists in careful letters. No one paid attention. She was just a kid passing time on a long flight. What they didn't know was that Emma had spent the last 3 years studying aviation with intense focus. Her father, Captain James Chen, was a pilot for American Airlines. For 3 years, he had been training his daughter using home flight simulators and emergency procedures. It had started as a game when Emma was 8. Her father had said, "I can't teach you in a real plane, but we have a simulator at home." What began as weekend fun became something much deeper. Emma had an unusual gift: she could visualize three-dimensional space and understand complex systems instinctively. She didn't memorize procedures because she was forced to. She memorized them because they fascinated her. By age 10, she could execute basic flight procedures. By 11, she understood emergency protocols that most student pilots didn't learn until flight school. But it was all theoretical. Practice. Neither Emma nor her father had imagined it would ever be anything more than that. Emma reviewed her notes as the plane climbed through 10,000 feet. The flight had been routine so far. Takeoff was smooth. Weather was clear. Captain Rodriguez had welcomed everyone on the intercom with the standard greeting. She went back to her notes, reviewing the systems of a Boeing 777, the same aircraft they were flying in. At 18,000 feet, the cabin lights flickered. Just for a moment. They dimmed and came back to full brightness. Patricia noticed. She had seen flickering lights before. Usually nothing. But sometimes, something. She made a mental note to mention it to the crew. Emma noticed too. She looked up, alert. In her training, her father had discussed electrical system failures. Most were not serious. But they could signal something bigger. She waited to see if it happened again. For the next hour, nothing unusual occurred. The flight continued normally. People read, watched movies, or slept. Emma reviewed her notes, running through emergency procedures in her mind. At 24,000 feet, the lights flickered again. 3 times in rapid succession. Patricia definitely noticed. She picked up the intercom phone in the galley. "Flight deck, this is the cabin. We're experiencing electrical issues with the cabin lights." There was no answer. She tried again. Still no response. Patricia frowned. Unusual, but not alarming. Maybe the crew was busy. She would try again later. Emma had gone very still. Her mind was working through possibilities. An intermittent electrical issue could mean many things. It could be nothing. But her father had taught her something important: never ignore small warnings. She turned to a page in her notebook titled, Electrical System Failures, and read through the symptoms, checking them against what she had observed. The flickering pattern didn't match any standard failure she had studied. That worried her. At 28,000 feet, something worse happened. Captain Rodriguez was in the left seat. First Officer Melissa Washington was in the right seat. They had been discussing weather near Denver when Captain Rodriguez felt something sharp in his chest, like lightning coming from inside him. He tried to speak, but his words came out strangled. His hand went to his chest. "Michael?" First Officer Washington asked, suddenly alarmed. "I don't, something's wrong." Captain Rodriguez managed. His body went rigid. He gasped for breath. First Officer Washington immediately unbuckled and reached for the emergency oxygen. "Michael, stay with me." But Captain Rodriguez was having a massive heart attack at 28,000 feet. There was nothing she could do except try to keep him stable and call for help. She grabbed the radio. "Denver Center, United 447. We have a medical emergency in the flight deck. Captain is unresponsive. Requesting immediate descent and nearest airport." The response came back clearly. "United 447, divert to Denver International. Cleared to begin descent immediately. Medical personnel standing by." First Officer Washington unbuckled from her seat and helped Captain Rodriguez onto the floor, placing an oxygen mask on his face. She ran through her emergency procedures. Her hands were shaking. She had trained for this, but never in a real flight. In simulators, yes. But not reality. She returned to the captain's seat and began the descent procedure. She was alone in the cockpit, but she was a trained pilot. She could handle this. Then everything went wrong all at once. The lights in the cockpit flickered and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in red glow. At the same time, every instrument on the panel went dark. First Officer Washington's hands froze. This wasn't a simple electrical failure. This was complete electrical system failure. "Denver Center, United 447 is experiencing total electrical failure," she said into the radio. "We have lost all primary instruments." The radio crackled. There was no response. The communications system had gone dark too. First Officer Washington felt panic rising in her throat. She forced it down. "Think logically," she told herself. Without electrical power, the autopilot was gone. Navigation systems were gone. Most instruments were dark. She was flying a massive aircraft by feel, with no way to communicate with air traffic control. No way to know if other aircraft were nearby. She reached for the backup power system switch. The battery was supposed to provide emergency power to critical systems. Nothing happened. The backup power wasn't working either. In the cabin, lights died completely. Emergency lighting came on, the same red glow everywhere. Passengers screamed. Some thought the plane was on fire. Others prayed. A mother pulled her two children close and said, "Everything is going to be okay," in a voice that didn't sound like she believed it. Patricia, the flight attendant, was knocked to the ground when the plane started descending. She pulled herself up, her heart racing. She had trained for emergencies. She began telling passengers to stay calm, to remain in their seats. But no one knew what was happening. In seat 12C, Emma Chen's mind was working faster than her heart was beating. She knew that a complete electrical failure was rare, but possible. She knew there were emergency power systems. But if those weren't working either? She looked around at the panicked passengers and made a decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, moving toward the front of the plane. "Excuse me, I need to get to the flight deck," she said to Patricia. Patricia looked at her with confusion. "Sit down right now," she said sharply. "Get back to your seat. Everyone needs to stay calm." But I need to. Back to your seat. Patricia's voice left no room for argument. A child needed to stay out of the way. This was a time for adults. Emma sat back down, but her mind was still racing. She knew things. She had trained for this. The cockpit crew, they were facing something that would require more than experience. It would require specific knowledge. She unbuckled again and moved forward, ignoring Patricia's shout. She had to get to the flight deck. She had to try. The flight deck door was closed and locked. Emma pounded on it. Let me in. I can help. From inside the cockpit, First Officer Washington heard the pounding. For a moment, she was distracted from the horror of her situation. Go back to your seat, she shouted, not opening the door. She couldn't leave the controls. Not even for a moment. I know about aircraft systems. Emma shouted back. My father is Captain James Chen. I've studied emergency procedures. Please let me in. First Officer Washington almost laughed. An 11-year-old girl claiming she could help. But she had no choice. She was alone, the plane was descending without any instruments, and she had no radio contact. She needed help. Even if it came from a child. She reached over and unlocked the door, keeping her right hand on the control wheel. Emma pushed into the cockpit and immediately took in the scene. Red emergency lighting. Dark instruments. Captain Rodriguez on the floor with an oxygen mask. First Officer Washington gripping the control wheel with white knuckles, her face twisted with concentration and fear. The electrical system is completely down, First Officer Washington said. Both primary and backup. I have no instruments, no radio, no autopilot. I'm flying this plane blind, and I don't know how long I can maintain altitude. Emma's mind shifted into problem-solving mode. Not emotion. Not fear. Just calculation. The standby instruments, Emma said. The 3-needle instrument. Is it still working? What? First Officer Washington looked at her. The standby attitude indicator, Emma said, pointing. It's battery-powered. Independent of the main electrical system. There should be one near the center of the instrument panel. First Officer Washington looked where Emma pointed. In the dim red light, she could see a small instrument. She tapped it. Incredibly, the needle moved. The standby attitude indicator was still working. My God. You're right, First Officer Washington whispered. The mechanical altimeter might be working too, Emma continued, her voice calm and steady. It's not electrical. It uses air pressure. First Officer Washington found the mechanical altimeter. It was working. What's our altitude? Emma asked. Approximately 22,000 feet, First Officer Washington said. Descending at about 2,000 feet per minute. If I can't slow this, we'll be on the ground in about 11 minutes. But I don't know where we are. I don't know if there's high ground below us. Emma was thinking. Her father had trained her for this. There was a procedure. The plane responds to the controls, she asked. Yes, First Officer Washington said. The mechanical controls still work. I can maintain altitude by feeling the plane, but I can't climb. The engines are too heavy. Then we need to fly lower where we can see the ground, Emma said. Manually navigate. Find an airport or somewhere to land. But at night, First Officer Washington started. Emma realized, it was late afternoon. The sun had not yet set. They were at 22,000 feet, well above the cloud layer in many areas. We descend carefully, Emma said, and we keep checking the attitude indicator to stay level. We go down until we can see the ground. Then we navigate visually. First Officer Washington felt something shift inside her. She was no longer completely alone. She still had no radio. No instruments except standby systems. But she had someone who understood what was happening. Someone who had actually trained for this. "Tell me what to do next," she said. As the plane descended through 20,000 feet, air traffic control in Denver realized something was wrong. They had lost all contact with United 447. No radar signal. No radio communication. The plane had vanished. Controllers began calling other planes in the area. One pilot reported seeing a plane descending rapidly through the clouds. Within minutes, emergency protocols were activated. Rescue teams were mobilized. Hospitals were put on alert. But no one knew if there were any survivors to rescue. In the cockpit, First Officer Washington was focused entirely on flying. Emma stood beside her, reading the standby instruments and giving feedback. "Nose is up slightly," Emma said. "We're climbing a little. Push the nose down 2 degrees. First Officer Washington made a tiny adjustment. The standby attitude indicator showed the plane leveling out. "Good," Emma said. "We're at 18,000 feet. Descent rate is steady at 1,800 feet per minute." Captain Rodriguez had regained consciousness. He was still breathing oxygen, still in trouble, but aware. First Officer Washington got him as comfortable as possible and focused entirely on keeping the plane in the air. Through the cockpit window, the landscape below was beginning to come into view. Mountains and valleys. Roads and fields. All flying past as they descended. "There." Emma pointed. "I see a highway. And something beyond it." First Officer Washington looked where Emma pointed. "An airport," she breathed. "That looks like an airport." It was actually a military base runway. But from 15,000 feet, it didn't matter. There was a long, flat stretch of concrete. That was all they needed. "We need to line up with that runway," Emma said. "What's our approach angle?" "We're too high and too far away," First Officer Washington said. "We need to come around for a proper approach." "Can you do that with just the standby attitude indicator and mechanical altimeter?" Emma asked. "I don't know," First Officer Washington admitted. "I've never tried." But she had to try. She gently banked the aircraft to the left, using the standby attitude indicator to keep the wings level. Below, the runway was getting closer. "We're at 10,000 feet, Emma said. Still descending at 1,700 feet per minute. "We're too steep," First Officer Washington said. "I need to flatten the descent." She adjusted the control wheel, pulling back slightly. The descent rate slowed. "Better," Emma said. "We're at 8,000 feet. Descent rate down to 1,500 feet per minute." The runway was coming into view now. First Officer Washington could see the landing lights. The long stretch of concrete. The terrifying reality that they were about to attempt something that had never been done before, landing a commercial aircraft with complete electrical failure using only standby instruments and mechanical controls. In the cabin, passengers had begun to understand something very serious was happening. They heard the pilot's voice on the intercom, crackling and distorted, "All passengers, brace for emergency landing. We are making an approach to a runway. Remain in your seats. Prepare for impact." An elderly man was praying. A young mother was holding her children close. A businessman was holding his phone, trying to send messages that couldn't go anywhere. Everyone was terrified. Everyone knew they might be about to die. "We're at 6,000 feet, Emma said calmly. "The runway is directly below us. Distance is about 3 miles. We're coming in too fast," First Officer Washington said. She could feel the speed in her hands. The controls were responding quickly to her inputs. That meant they were moving fast. "You need to slow down," Emma said. "The engines. Can you reduce power?" "The throttles are manual," First Officer Washington said. She reached down and pulled the throttle levers back. The engines began to reduce power. The descent rate began to increase slightly as the speed decreased. "That's helping," Emma said. "We're at 5,000 feet. Distance is about 2.5 miles. First Officer Washington's hands were shaking. She had trained for this in simulators, but this was real. 156 people in the cabin were depending on her ability to land this aircraft. And they were all depending on an 11-year-old girl to tell her what to do. "Adjust your heading slightly to the right," Emma said. "The runway is moving left." First Officer Washington adjusted. The runway moved back into alignment below them. 4,000 feet. Distance about 2 miles. Descent rate 1,200 feet per minute. Speed is good. You're doing well. The encouragement in Emma's voice was surprising. This child sounded like she had done this 1,000 times. 3,000 feet. Distance 1.5 miles. Below them, people on the ground were watching. Security personnel at the military base. Fire trucks and ambulances. All watching the aircraft descending with no radio communication, no sign that anyone was in control. 2,000 feet. 1 mile to the runway. First Officer Washington could see the runway clearly now. Landing lights. The runway numbers painted on concrete. The runway looked impossibly narrow, impossibly short. 1,500 feet. Descent rate 1,000 feet per minute. You need to start flaring now. Flaring meant adjusting the aircraft angle so the nose came up slightly and descent slowed as the wheels approached the ground. One of the most critical parts of landing. First Officer Washington pulled back gently on the control wheel. The standby attitude indicator showed the nose beginning to come up. The descent rate decreased. "Good," Emma said. "Keep the nose up a bit more. We want to be nearly level when we touch down. 1,000 feet. The runway is directly below us. Distance is about 1/4 mile." First Officer Washington's entire body was focused on the controls. She could see the runway lights. She could feel the plane responding. Everything was happening in slow motion and fast forward at once. 500 feet. You're looking good. Nose is at the right angle. Descent rate is steady at 500 feet per minute. 200 feet. Prepare for touchdown. The ground was rushing up now. First Officer Washington could see details. The runway surface. The landing lights. Emergency vehicles positioned on the side. 100 feet. 50 feet. 30 feet. And then, with a gentle but solid thump, the landing gear touched the runway. The wheels made contact. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the weight settled onto the landing gear. The nose gear came down. The plane was rolling on the runway. First Officer Washington pushed the throttles all the way to reverse thrust. The engines roared as they pushed backward, slowing the aircraft. She pressed harder on the brakes. The plane was slowing down. Fast. Too fast almost, but not too fast to lose control. Emma was counting down the remaining runway. You're good. Plenty of runway left. You're going to make it. The aircraft rolled down the runway, slowing, until finally, with a gentle coast, it came to a complete stop. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then First Officer Washington realized she could breathe again. She had been holding her breath. We did it, Emma whispered. The cockpit door burst open. Paramedics rushed in. Within seconds, Captain Rodriguez was on a stretcher, being rushed to an ambulance waiting on the runway. First Officer Washington was being checked for injuries, even though she was physically fine. It was her mind that needed time to recover. But before she could say anything, before the chaos could fully take over, she looked at Emma. You saved 156 lives, she said. You saved all of us. We saved us, Emma said quietly. Together. The passengers didn't know yet what had happened. They only knew the plane had landed. As the emergency doors opened and they began evacuating down the slides, fear turned to relief, then to questions. How had the pilot landed without instruments? How had they even survived? When the full story came out, that an 11-year-old girl had guided the landing, it spread across the world like lightning. The story made international headlines: child pilot saves 156 lives. 11-year-old girl lands crippled aircraft. Emma's photograph was everywhere. Her father appeared on news programs, telling the story of how he had trained his daughter, never imagining it would actually save lives. But Emma hated the attention. She was 11 years old. She wanted to go to school and be normal. Instead, she was famous. People recognized her on the street. News vans followed her family. What mattered to her was that Captain Rodriguez survived. The heart attack had been serious, but he recovered with surgery and rehabilitation. First Officer Washington became one of Emma's close friends. The bond they had formed in those desperate minutes would last a lifetime. A month after the landing, Emma was invited to speak at an aviation conference. She was terrified. But she knew she had something important to say. Standing at a podium in front of hundreds of pilots and engineers, she spoke into the microphone. People keep asking me what I was thinking during the landing, she began. The truth is, I wasn't thinking. I was just doing what my father had trained me to do. I was solving problems step by step. That's what any person can do in an emergency: focus on what you can control, solve the immediate problem, then move to the next one. She paused, looking out at the faces watching her. But there's something else I want to say, she continued. My father taught me that aviation is not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being prepared. It's about training for things you hope never happen. It's about respect, respecting the machine, respecting the procedures, respecting human limitations. She looked directly at the camera transmitting this to the world. When people say I'm a hero, I don't feel like one, she said. I feel like someone who was prepared for something that shouldn't have happened. And I think we should all be more prepared. Parents should teach their children. Schools should teach students how to think about problems logically. Adults should remember that children can be capable of more than we give them credit for. Emma's story sparked something in aviation and beyond. The Federal Aviation Administration created new guidelines for emergency training. They began inviting young people to learn about aviation. Some schools started teaching basic aviation principles, not to turn students into pilots, but to teach problem-solving and critical thinking. First Officer Washington continued flying. But now she made it her mission to mentor young pilots, teaching them that sometimes the best thing you could do in an impossible situation was to listen to new perspectives, even if they came from unexpected places. Captain Rodriguez, after his recovery, wrote a book about that day. The title was Trust: How an 11-Year-Old Girl Taught Me to Believe. In it, he reflected on how he had been so focused on his own expertise that he had almost missed help when it was offered by someone he had assumed could not possibly help him. Emma finished her school year as a normal student, as normal as a famous person could be. She was still small for her age. She still preferred to sit quietly and observe. But now, when teachers looked at her, they saw someone different. They saw a child who had been forged in crisis and had come through it stronger. When asked what she wanted to do with her life, Emma said simply, I want to be a pilot. Like my father. And I want to help people prepare for things that seem impossible. Her father smiled when he heard this. He had always known his daughter was special. But he had learned something that day of the landing, that preparation, training, and clear thinking could turn special into extraordinary. The Boeing 777 that Emma had landed was retired from service. It was placed in an aviation museum as a monument to human ingenuity, preparation, and the courage of two women who had worked together to accomplish the impossible. At 16 years old, Emma Chen had already logged over 100 hours in actual aircraft with her father supervising. She was on track to become one of the youngest licensed pilots in history. But more importantly, she had become an advocate for education, preparation, and believing in human potential. She still had her worn notebook with flight procedures and emergency protocols, private, written on the cover. But now it also contained something new, what I learned about life. In it, she had written, "The plane didn't go silent because of me. But I was prepared when it did. I learned that you don't know what you're capable of until you're tested. I learned that fear is not the opposite of courage, it's what courage is made of. I learned that the smallest person in the room can have the biggest impact if they know what they're doing. And I learned that my father was right when he said that preparation is not about preparing for disaster. It's about being ready to help when disaster comes. I'm not special because I landed a plane. I'm special because I was trained. And anyone can be trained. Anyone can be prepared. Anyone can be brave. You just have to believe that you can." This was the real message of Emma's story, not that one child had done something extraordinary, but that preparation and courage were available to anyone willing to work for them. That the greatest heroism was not always dramatic, sometimes it was simply being ready, being calm, and being willing to help when help was needed. Years later, Emma would tell audiences, "That day, I didn't save a plane. I just did what I had learned to do." We all have that potential. To be more than we seem. To do more than people expect. To change the world by being prepared to help when the moment comes. That's what I learned at 30,000 feet when the plane went silent. And in auditoriums and lecture halls across the world, people would listen and think about what they could prepare for, what skills they could learn, what knowledge they could gain, not for glory, but for the simple, profound reason that someday, someone might need help. And they could be ready to give it.